My name is Eric Berg, and I will be presenting on Bill S3625, the New York State Green and Healthy Procurement Act. Healthy and Green Procurement Act. I'd like to thank my wonderful group for compiling all this incredible information, and my advisor, Professor Cohen. So what I'm going to be talking about today is kind of the simple rundown: what the bill is, what problem it's addressing, what purchases did we specifically focus on and why, what are the environmental and human health problems that come from the current state of purchasing in New York State, what are the proposed solutions we came up with, what issues arise from those solutions, and finally, how are we going to define and measure success. So the bill was originally introduced on February 13th, 2015 by Senator Brad Cohen. He's a Democrat in the New York State Legislature. This calls to establish a green and healthy procurement criteria for how New York State and its agencies make purchases. So specifically, right now, the procurement process has a very limited criteria for what they buy, and this has big economic costs as well as problems to the human health and environment because of how they get these purchases. So the four we decided to focus on were paper, vehicles, electronics, and building materials. This is either because the bill directly stated that we had to focus on them, or we decided that this had the highest impact overall on humans as well as how they're made. So the first one is paper. To make paper, you have to cut down a lot of trees. That's how it's always pretty much been done. It's a big problem for the forest, and so to bleach the paper after it gets to the pulping plant, you have to use some kind of chlorine compound. That releases chlorine into the air, and it can destroy thousands of ozone atoms. Vehicles, we all know about greenhouse gas emissions, but also the particulate matter, especially 2.5, can get into the human lungs and it causes respiratory disease. So current fossil fuel combustion engines aren't good for that. In terms of electronics, most electronics are made with lead. It's basically the industry standard. High energy use, and 1 microgram per deciliter of lead in the human bloodstream has been linked to a 0.5 point loss in IQ. For building materials, we decided to focus on PVC piping and vinyl flooring specifically. They're made with vinyl chloride. Incinerating these, because most of them just go straight to the landfill, releases harmful toxins, dioxin, into the atmosphere. And it's not a very recyclable material. Only 1% actually ever gets recycled. So we decided, what are we going to propose for solutions? For paper, we decided we're going to make sure that we get rid of as much chlorine as possible. So one of the ways to do that is to bleach it with ozone, and that's a bleacher in the picture. And all New York State agencies have to purchase their paper using 100% post-consumer recycled material. It no longer goes to landfill, it recycles all the way back. For vehicles, we want to increase the purchase of hybrid and electric vehicles because it phases out our dependence on oil, there's an increase in miles per gallon, and there's less tailpipe emissions. So, electronics. We wanted to make sure that in the bill it specifically calls for Energy Star labeled products. That's because there's a 30 to 65%, depending on the item, reduction in overall energy use by using those products, and we want to phase out all lead as much as possible using copper, tin, other types of materials. For building materials, the overall elimination of PVC is the big one. Whether that's using copper piping, steel piping, a little more energy intensive, but it's definitely worth it to stop using PVC. In terms of flooring, linoleum is a renewable resource that you can grow it, and it's made from flax, so that's a much better use of material than just throwing down this unsustainable resource that just gets thrown away and goes into a landfill and you burn it. Having said that, there's issues with all of these. Especially the paper industry will say that none of their wastewater treatment has any dioxin, any chlorine, anything that gets out. In addition to that, when you recycle paper, you don't just get the lignin that's left over, you get all of the ink, all the sticky fibrous material that comes with it. And it's not really, they're not really sure what to do with all that material yet. It's very hard to break those components up. Vehicles, while they're a better option, using an electric vehicle requires mining for metals. This is a lithium mine. It still requires degradation of habitat, destruction of natural ecosystems to mine these things. For electronics, the concern is that the replacements for lead aren't that much better. None of these options really have a much better impact on the environment. They might be slightly better, but currently lead is still a very beneficial material to use in making electronics. E-waste, there's still a lot that goes in, and it's very difficult to actually know where to put it. 80% of our e-waste currently still goes overseas. It's very difficult to figure out if we're going to be able to stop doing that. For building materials, the structural integrity, this is a metal pipe that burst, is still a big problem. There's longitudinal cracking. PVC is good for that because it doesn't break down very easily. In terms of the linoleum flooring I mentioned, flaxseed still requires a lot of fertilizer and pesticide inputs. So to grow it, you still have to harm the environment. So for defining and measuring success, we decided for each one of these, we basically want to lower the dioxin, chlorine, or other carbon emissions that come with them. If we can measurably lower those because of our purchasing power, that has a big impact. New York State currently has $150 billion of a budget, so any way that we can find cost-effective solutions, as well as reducing our impact on the environment and our energy use, is a big thing. And especially for electronics, if we can lower our electricity use, that will be massive. So I'll leave you with a small quote. It's not a great one from the architect, but basically politicians do care. There are people that actually do want to see this happen, and if we can support those politicians and give our help to these kind of plans, we can actually make a significant difference and change a culture that does not take the environment and our human health into account. Thanks. Questions?
Yeah, I think Professor Cohen will argue that the American automobile market likes big cars, which are mostly fuel guzzling. And mostly when we see images of hybrid or electric cars, they're mainly small. So is there a way of having like big cars which are electric? And how do you increase demand for like electric cars? And
so the fleet of New York State specifically does have big cars. There's always going to be a need for, like, say, a garbage truck is part of the New York State fleet, but you can still find a way to, for instance, they're working on making hybrid trucks. That's not a big thing yet. But overall, a lot of the New York fleet requires smaller cars, like cop cars, the EPA, things like that. They still use hybrids, or they're trying to transition to that. This is one of the first steps in terms of how to change the overall view of how cars are. It's definitely something to think about in terms of procuring larger vehicles that emit less greenhouse gases, but it's kind of also a consumer-based thing that companies will try to cater to what their consumers want.
Thanks, Eric. Great presentation. Yeah, I had a question about your statistic about e-cycling waste that goes abroad. I think you said 80% goes abroad. Do you know what political or economic mechanisms permit that to happen? And if you've done research on that, is there any way to change?
I would also ask my group for a little clarification on this, but as far as I know, it's just most companies, it's much cheaper to send it away than to throw it into a landfill and have us deal with it. And as far as I know, some countries do want the waste because it's a money-making venture for them, because they can harvest little bits out of, say, a computer or out of an iPhone, something like that. There's a lot of little things that go into these computers that are very valuable. But I don't know the exact mechanism as to why, besides some people will just accept it because they'll take money and it's profitable to them.
I just had two questions. Quickly, when you mentioned 2.5, is that particulate size, that it's a harmful particulate size? Is that,
Micro.
okay.
Yeah.
And then my second question actually involves your measurement process. So when you talked about a few alternatives, and you discussed how some of those alternatives are in themselves problematic in some ways.
Yeah.
In the way that you're measuring whether or not this is actually an advancement, a move forward, progress in sustainability, are those metrics currently being used in other cities? Are they a standard metric that's being applied for greening of cities? And is New York doing this right now?
They're working on it. This is a bill that is currently being discussed. Not many do, really. Very few states or even counties are taking into account this environmental impact, period. Some agencies, government-wise, especially federal level, are, but overall, not really. Some of our solutions, again, aren't perfect, but what we're trying to see is, because of how these materials are made and used, they offer a better solution, but imperfect.